Hello, and welcome to this probably long, likely meandering, possibly inconclusive review for The Godwhale by T.J. Bass. So this is an interesting book. Its appearance on my to-read shelf was also interesting. It wasn't part of my almost indiscriminate November buying haul last year. I'm not sure how or where I got it, to be honest, but it is in excellent condition. So when I bought it, the spine looked as if it had never ever been creased. It still doesn't look like it's been used an awful lot. There was almost no foxing on the covers. There still isn't an awful lot. It has the University of Sussex bookshop sticker there on the back. And inside the front cover, you've got a couple of crossed out labels, and that's virtually it. So it doesn't seem to have done that huge merry-go-round of secondhand bookshops and stamps and stickers and everything that most of my SFF has. It's in really good condition still. I went down a significant rabbit hole regarding the cover artist. So I really love the cover. This wasn't the cover art for the first edition American. This is the first or second UK edition. It's Methuen Press. And I really love this cover. So the artist isn't credited anywhere in the book, which is a shame, but it's a thing that used to happen. I have seen online some people saying that there is a signature somewhere on this cover, but not sufficient to be able to identify. And I can't see it at all on mine. I suspect it's under the Methuen stamp. So as a guess, I'm going to suggest that this was possibly the artwork of Terry Oakes. Terry Oakes was an artist who did do a lot of cover art for Methuen Press around that time. And incidentally, it's quite difficult to find out the artists that worked for Methuen. Methuen did a lot of kids' books. So if you start Googling for artists who worked for them, you're going to end up with kids' books. A lot of kids' books. Okay, back to this artwork. I think the sharp figure definitions and outlines that Terry Oakes did in a lot of his other work that is credited to him are comparable to the strong outlines of the whale, the Rockall Maru, and her accompanying little satellite ships, which don't really exist. None of this really exists in the book, but I don't care that much. It's very pretty. Now, if you look at the background shading of the ocean, I would suggest that a lot of the cover art Terry Oakes did for Dune books shows a similar sort of colour gradation and use of colour and of angles. So yeah, I'm going with Terry Oakes. Also, on the tail here on the back, I think you can probably see it. You've got that stippling to suggest rust. And what is clearly not a mechanical whale. This whale on this cover is very much a biological whale, but it was trying to suggest mechanical. Anyway, let me know what you think. Let me know if you know more about Terry Oakes' work. And let me know if you think this is his too. Or if you know who it is, let me know. I'm curious. So this book, I've got a vague notion that it might have been recommended to me by someone who knows that I love classic SFF and that I love marine themes, because the marine theme here is strong. There are on the back recommendations by Edmund Cooper, which I would probably take sight unseen, and the Sydney Morning Herald, which they seem like strange bedfellows, but whatever. Anyway, aside from those elements, the cover, I knew nothing. The cover, the recommendations, the themes, which are my sort of themes, I knew nothing about this author or this book when I picked it up. So I looked into Thomas J. Bassier, wrote as T.J. Bass when he wrote science fiction. He was born in 1932 and died in 2011. He was a medical man, an American, possibly physician or possibly pathologist. Different sites have suggested different things. He graduated from the University of Iowa. in 59, and he's got apparently a number of non-fiction books that I think might have dated worse than his science fiction did. He only seems to have written 2, possibly 3 SF novels, depending on where you're looking for it, for information. So if I go to TJ Bass on Wikipedia, Wikipedia is free, I'm a subscriber. It's given me so much over the years. Wikipedia only lists the 2 novels, the first one being Half Past Human from 71, which was the first Hive novel, and is described as a fix-up, and The Godwhale from 74, which is a follow-on from Half Past Human. This may be a number 2. It stands perfectly well as a standalone. You don't need to have read anything else to understand everything in this book. Wait. If you're going to understand everything in this book, you don't need to have read a previous book to understand it. Let's put it that way. Because one reviewer, and there aren't many reviews for this book online, but one reviewer that I read said that he had to read it with Google because there were so many terms he didn't understand. This was not a problem I had, but I do have some bioscience background. He's got a list of 7 short stories, TJ Bass, not the reviewer. Star Itch, Star Seeder, Half Past Human, which is obviously part of the fix-up of the first novel. The Song of Kaya, A Game of Biochess, The Beast of 309, and Rockall Maru, which is obviously something to do with the Godwhale, because Rockall Maru is the name of the Godwhale in this book. Another interesting thing that I found about TJ Bass, or Thomas J. Bassler, on the internet was that he had controversial claims when it came to diet and smoking, which are the things that he wrote his non-fiction books about. He claimed that non-smoking wasn't going to cause heart disease, which these days no one would really fly with that one. And he's been quoted as saying that by a couple of athletes, one of whom was a runner and died of heart failure while running. So I've got a feeling that Thomas J. Bassler just quietly slid under the rug in many regards after that. And because he didn't have a huge quantity of science fiction out there, I'm not going to say that he's ignored, but if you go online and you look at how many people have reviewed or rated this book, there's not a lot of them. And when you look at how many people have said anything about, there's even less. And if you try to look for a YouTube review, there's one guy who's done one, but all the others seem to be AI written, and they bear less resemblance to this book than an AI generated picture of a Viking bears to a human being. Just saying. Not keen on AI art. Have you noticed? Okay. So the background of the author in bioscience comes across really, really clearly in this book. He apparently had the non-fiction books, and I would say that the bioscience is really strong in this book. If you like biological science fiction, this book is really for you. The other thing it is, in my personal opinion, is it is 100% cyberpunk. Back in the 90s, I was reading anything on any cyberpunk list, some of which I never saw quite understood why were there, but this one is pure cyberpunk in many, many regards. So the story doesn't actually start with the whale in question. It starts with Larry DeVar, who Bass insists on calling a hemi-human all through this book. Okay, so let's start with Larry DeVar. Larry DeVar lives in our far future, but the book's far past. So as a young man, it starts with him waiting to go into some sort of parkland for scheduled recreation time. He talks to Belt. Belt is some sort of cybernetic AI, communicates with the computer mind of the city, and we see a world that is so far from ours that it is pure science fiction and pure cyberpunk. Larry spends the day doing whatever he wants in this park, and then he goes back to the city. I feel strongly that this city is not the Hive. I feel that this is pre-Hive in many ways. But Bass isn't he's strong on description, but less strong on explanation, and you could probably interpret it either way. So, on the way home, Larry cuts a prank to steal some tasty flavours, as they call them, and as a result of that, he has a massive accident. His body is severed at the waist. He goes into the hospital facilities, which are there to save him and reduce his pain, and they try to reattach his body and regrow the legs. They manage to do a lot of it, but not most of it, and finally he ends up having to have this radical new operation, which all the tissue below the waist is removed, and it's tied up and fixed up, and he's provided with a mechanical leg set. This is where we are in pure cyberpunk, and this is very early in the novel. So Larry and his wonderful new mannequin go riding and running, and no one can tell, until one day when Larry meets an attractive female who indicates that she would find him sexually attractive until she realizes that he's got a mechanism, at which case she rejects him because apparently in this far future people are as unpleasant towards disability as some people in this world can be as well. Larry is heavily depressed. He can talk to his mechanism, but he can't have sex, and people find him ugly, so he decides to go into deep sleep until biological technology has improved to the point where he can have a full body again. At this early in the novel, we are forced to conclude that Larry is more than a bit of a dick. He is childish, he is petulant, he is exceptionally foolish, takes no responsibility for his actions, he's unappealing. This kind of presages the whole novel. At no point does T.J. Bass really do characters very well. He's got individuals that bear the narrative or the plot or the events. They're recognizable individuals, but they're recognizable in third person from the outside. None of these people really live and breathe for you. If you need strong characters that you can relate to on a person-to-person basis, this book will not be for you. If you love science fiction concepts and biological fiction concepts, then this book is absolutely for you because it jam-packs it in to an extent you wouldn't believe. I didn't believe. I still don't believe. So Larry goes back into suspended animation. He's reanimated a while later when they have got the technology. They also have a starship called Olga. The Guiding World computer is called Olga. They've created a Procyon. They've created a starship with which they're going to go to the stars and see the stars. They want Larry to join him because he has healthy early genetic material, and there's been genetic drift in the race, and they want him to go with after he's been fixed. He's pretty keen, not certain, but pretty keen. He sees a bit of the world, and then finally realizes that the way in which they're going to fix him is by having created a clone, which they've already done, and they've brought to maturation of him, and they're going to use the clone's biological material to fix him. Shades of The Island coming in here. The Island is a good movie. They did it well. I guess also, what is that Ishiguro one? Never Let Me Go? Yeah. The whole notion of a clone being created to provide spare parts for the human from which they're created is one that science fiction has loved and played with for years. It's a great theme. Larry rejects this notion. He sends the clone with his biological material off on the ship, but he himself goes back into a suspended animation to wait until humanity can cure him without killing anyone. By the way, if you haven't noticed this already, this is a very spoilery type review. I don't think you can spoiler this because the actual reading experience is what's going to get you. There's not really a plot with a conclusion that needs spoilering. But, I don't know. You make your own decisions about that. When Larry wakes up next time, we don't know until the end of the novel, but it's probably about 2,000 years from his original time. And far from advanced, we have reached the nightmare future. To us, it's definitely a nightmare of the Hive. Presumably the future that T.J. Bass mentioned in his first novel. In this future, we eventually find that the hive is a computer mind-controlled, packed in underground living style which covers all the continents of Earth, is packed full of humans which are only barely human by our recognition. We do find a few characters that we relate to, but generally speaking, they're less than human. And at this point, there's no respect for human life. Human life is protein. If it's been rejected at an early age, it goes back into the protein vats. And Larry Deva, as a hemi-human, or an amputee, as we'd call it, is reanimated and given a jar full of suicide red cordial. It sounds like Red Bull, but it isn't. Told to go away, drink that, and commit suicide, which he doesn't do. Now, before I go any further, by this stage we've got the hive, and it's the same hive that is used in the first book. TJ refers to the citizens, members of the hive, citizens of the hive, as Nebishes. Nebish, my understanding of it, is an American Yiddish word. I know Yiddish didn't come from America, but after it migrated to America, it evolved in a whole new way. It's normally meant to regard someone as poor, unfortunate, weak, timid, fearful, basically a lesser human. And by calling every member of the hive a Nebish, TJ Bass clearly indicates where his sympathies lie in this particular world. So, at this point, we have a kind of sleep-awake story. Larry Deva refuses to commit suicide. He escapes into the in-between walls, where he comes across another reject of the Nebish society. Big Her was a baby, and the way they create babies is nothing like anything we'd recognize. It's closer to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. It's all mechanical. And there's this fascinating point in there where they talk about pitting. They apparently put a needle into the pituitary to reduce the human's ability to something. I'm not sure what, to be honest. And they all have 4 toes. Apparently they cut off one of the toes. He's never clear about whether it's the big toe or the small toe. I would imagine the small toe. I don't know. The toe thing was never explained. Maybe the toe thing is explained in the first book, and I need to read that one. Not sure. Anyway. So Larry Deva, who has learnt to walk on his hands and stuff, escapes into the in-between worlds, and he meets Big Her. Big Her was a baby Harley who'd been thrown into the pile of rejected babies for being a gargoyle, which is ugly and apparently stronger, bigger, and has hair. He was plucked from that pile as an emergency mental health moment for a woman who was under stress, but as soon as he got old enough to walk and talk, he was taken away from her and meant to be disposed of, but he survived in the wars. So Larry and Big Ha form a kind of friendship. Living in the in-between walls, they steal food and water. But it's a horrible kind of shadow existence. And even though it's all the Big Ha's ever known, Larry isn't happy there. He fills Big Ha's head with stories of the outdoors and how amazing it is until they decide to try and escape the hive. Now, at this point, but sideways, we finally get the Rockwell Maru, the Godwhale. The Godwhale was a harvester, purely mechanical being. Anywhere on the internet that tells you that it's half whale, half harvester, no, it is 100% mechanical harvester. I love the imaginary imagery of calling it a whale and calling it the Rockwell Maru and treating it like a independent AI bearing individual, but it isn't a whale, it's a machine. Anyway, this machine and all of its type are wrecked. They're lying on the bottom of the ocean. They're slowly degrading. The Rockwell Maru is the only one that has still got any signal or power. The reason for that is that the world is sterile. This hive has completely sterilized the planet. There's no life in the ocean, not even diatoms or bacteria. There's no plant living on land that isn't in service to the hive, and all of them are sterile. They've been sterilized and can only be bred specially to be planted out to create food. So you've got this really complex, really fascinating, totally dystopian world in which the only people who exist are the Nebushes in the hive, which to our eyes probably wouldn't come across as terribly human, and a few benthics. So the Rockamlaroo is dying. She sends out her small mobile unit, Iron Trilobite, and I love that name. I loved Iron Trilobite. Who couldn't? And he searches all the waves, and he's communicating with the Rockamlaroo, who he refers to as my deity. And eventually he reaches the shores just off the hive in some part of the world. There he encounters real humans, and he's really excited because what the Rockamlaroo needs is humans to invigorate her with a will to live and a reason to live. Here he finds humans that would be recognizable as humans to us. Whether they escaped the hive early on or they've always lived there, we're never told. We can make up our own imaginations of that. But they're basically five-toed. They live in these underwater submerged cities. They live by stealing food from the gardens of the hive since the oceans are sterile. They refuse to have anything to do with Iron Trilobite. They're terrified of machines. But he reaches there. His deity goes quiet. He goes to the hive and is sent to the wrecking pile. From the wrecking pile, he is later recruited due to the activities of Larry and Big Whore. This could be a long review, hey? Larry and Big Whore have stolen a boat from two sewage workers. These are two characters we actually have encountered, and I think there are only 3 characters in the entire hive that we ever encounter. And they're escaping the sewers. Now, if you thought that Garbage World by Charles Platt was icky, the escape from the sewers is a biological nightmare of grossness. I think TJ Bass loved the sewers. How anything that has sewers like this on the planet could possibly be sterile is a different question, because they are teeming with everything, including botflies. So warning, content warning. If you have the same horror of botflies that at least one viewer has, do not read this book, because it's botfly heavy for a certain section. Won't say anything more about that. They do escape. They make contact with the benthics. They're living there, and when Iron Trilobite tries to resurrect the boat, he ends up going with them also to the benthics. Eventually the Rockamlaroo is reanimated and comes and starts serving the benthics. Now at this point, the hive creates a new style of human to combat the benthics. As part of Iron Trilobite and Big Her and Larry joining the benthics, they needed to convince them somehow there was a deity out there that Iron Trilobite worked for, so he wasn't a real machine or something like that. So he prayed and he prayed for the Rockamlaroo to reseed the seas and make them healthy again, which none of them believed could actually happen. But then one night there's this strange thing, and there's fireworks. Iron Trilobite gets a response, though it's not from the Rockamlaroo, and all of a sudden the world starts seeding again. So we watch the ocean slowly coming back to life with diatoms and bacteria, and later fish, and later sharks, and all this stuff. And the small islands start becoming revegetated as well. It is quite fascinating. Now, as the mankind starts to survive independent of the hive, that's the benthics, inhabit the islands, eat from the sea, and the Rockamlaroo comes back to save them, the hive starts this punitive war with the benthics. And in order to do that, they create a line of new style clones that aren't really Nebushes. They call them Arnolds, which are heavier, healthier, stronger, capable of living outside, and capable of combating the benthic, what they think is insurrections into the world. And thus we get, at about halfway through, what I think is the main antagonistic plot in this book, which is the hive versus the benthics. And that's quite interesting, but it's interesting in biological senses as well, because the Arnolds are created lacking amino acid sequences. They're reliant on hive-produced amino acid bread for their very existence. So the story of how one escapes and joins with the benthics is a huge story. And they use the most primitive DNA that they can find on record to make them, which is Larry de Vars. This is already a long review, so I'm going to stop there. What exactly happens? It happens. It's a great story. It is so jam-packed with information that its 306 pages seem like a lot longer, and it's slow to read. It's slow to read for a number of reasons. The huge amount of information, the very nebulous approach to plot. It has plot and it has storytelling, but it is sometimes hard to tell the point. Most of this book doesn't have a lot of point. So page 14, I made a point about squamous epithelial cells. So I know what squamous epithelial cells. TJ Bass clearly knew what squamous epithelial cells are. If you don't, this might be one of the moments when you need Google search by you to check it. Like I said, lots of bioscience, lots of cyberpunk, very, very heavily jam-packed. Information heavy, concept rich, I would call this. I wouldn't call it well written. The writing is serviceable. It's a perfectly decent vehicle for a very packed story. It's like there are pages and pages of this book that are basically concepts being given you. Many of them bioscience. You've got narratives of like the escape through the sewers, like Grandmaster Odo and Drum, who are retiring to live out the rest of their lives in comfort, peace, much like Australian superannuation. Before they find out there aren't enough resources to go around, they're going to go back into suspended animation, which they fight against. You've got the clones, Budchild as provided. What you really don't have is you don't have gorgeous writing. You don't have characters you can strongly associate to, and you don't have a strong story arc. There are stories, there's lots of stories. Sometimes you've got 3 stories on one page, but you don't feel like this book is really one story arc, and the ending doesn't really feel like an ending. It just feels like the end. The Rock on Nauru, the Godwhale, for which I bought this book, barely appears, if at all, in the first third of the book. Throughout the rest of the book, it's there, but it isn't the focus that I was really hoping that it would be ever. But I didn't really mind too much. I love the description of the benthics and their underwater culture. A lot of it isn't well explained, but I enjoyed it. So in the 70s, by the way, there was a huge talk about how underwater domes were going to be the future of science, research, recreation. And I think this was written during that period. Ultimately, that proved impractical for people, too expensive, too difficult, and too prone to infection. But I think that TJ Bass's concept of benthics was based upon those. The Hive described as the nightmare future, taking all the worst of Make Room, Brave New World, anything else you can imagine, a great view of where the world could end up. And there's so much detail to his world that your brain is just packed with this information, and that's great. So I loved his imagery of a warped world of lifeless oceans, strange hive-like larval human beings living in these intriguing, disgusting hives with paper-thin skulls rolling on the beaches because they've been dehumanized in so many ways. And apparently I'm not the only one. This book was obviously well enough thought of that it got republished by the SF Masterworks series. So it's out there somewhere. I don't know who's reading it, and I don't know why they aren't reviewing it, but I think that it's such an unusual, such a well-conceived book. And the writing isn't spectacular, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's grammatically correct. It's It's okay, it's just workmanlike, it's not beautiful. It's out of the common run. I think a lot of people who'd encounter it wouldn't know what to do. I think people who've come from less scientific backgrounds may not know what it's talking about and might need that Google search with them. But, well, it may not be for the faint-hearted, especially not the botflies in the sewers, gonna say. The lack of respect for humanity is going to appeal to certain niches of SF writers. It certainly appealed to me. The idea of how you could step by step progress through to a future which has no reverence for any form of life, let alone human life. Well, it was lightly done. I really enjoyed it. I do think this is a book for many people. I don't know that it's for everyone, but for the strong SF writer, it is for you. If you are a cyberpunk reader and you haven't read it, which I'm going to guess is most of you, I think you should. I really think. What else? If you need that emotive bond with your characters, I don't know. I don't know that it really will be for you. I will try and include with a link to the one other review from a real human being online that I could find for this one. So, yes, I'm very glad I read it. Yes, I enjoyed it. I think I will have to reread this one a few times to even start to get a lot of the things about it. It's not a short read, but I think it's a valuable one. And an intriguing one. I was not disappointed in the ocean connection. And, wow, this is a long review. Yes, good book. If you are any of the groups I mentioned, or intrigued in any way by what I've said, I think you should read it. I'm very glad I did. I want to thank you for watching this rather long review, and read good books, and have a good Christmas, because it's that Christmas time of month.